Snow had started falling again by the time the doors of the Hartley's Landing courthouse swung open. And Naomi Fenwick stepped out into it, with her 6-year-old daughter's mittened hand wrapped tight in her own. The papers were signed. After 14 months of lawyers, of forwarded emails printed out and highlighted, of nights spent lying awake, doing arithmetic that never came out right, it was finished. Her ex-husband, Byron Kessler, had walked away with the lake house, the 2 vehicles, the joint accounts, and the small commercial building on Main Street that everyone in town assumed was hers. On paper she was leaving with a used Corolla, a duffel bag of Elodie's things, and whatever was left in a checking account after the last legal invoice cleared. The people filing out behind her kept their voices low, the way people in a small town do when they think they're being kind. Poor thing, married up and it didn't take. She heard all of it, or imagined she did, which amounted to the same weight on her shoulders. A few of them she'd known her whole life. The woman who ran the pharmacy, a man who'd coached minor hockey with Byron for a season. They looked at her with that careful pitying softness people reserve for someone they've quietly decided is finished. Byron came out a minute later, wool coat open, chin up, his mother Genevieve on one side, and his girlfriend Meredith on the other. He'd always had a way of arranging himself so a room noticed him, and the courthouse steps were no different. He paused near Naomi like a man pausing to comment on the weather. "Well," he said. "I hope you felt it was worth it." Naomi didn't answer. She looked down at Elodie instead, at the pom-pom on her toque already gone lopsided with snow, and something in her steadied. "You ready to head out, bug?" Elodie nodded, but her eyes were shiny, and her mouth was doing the thing it did when she was trying very hard not to cry in front of grown-ups. She hated the way they talked to her mother. She was 6 and she couldn't have told you what a lean was, but she understood tone perfectly, and the tone people used with Naomi lately made her want to bite someone. Genevieve gave a little laugh, the practiced kind that isn't really a laugh. "It's a hard age to be starting from nothing, Naomi. I'll say that for you." She adjusted her scarf. "Though I suppose you're used to hard." Meredith smiled at the snow like it was all very amusing. Naomi still said nothing. She wasn't angry, exactly, though there was a version of her, some earlier and rawer version, who would have been. That version had spent a lot of the last year being angry, and had learned that anger cost her sleep and gave the Kesslers nothing they didn't already have. So she just nodded, once, the way you nod at someone whose opinion has finally stopped mattering, and turned toward the parking lot with her daughter. None of them. Not Byron. Not Jeep. Not the pharmacist or the hockey coach or the reporter from the Muskoka Weekly who'd come to cover a different case, and stayed out of boredom. None of them knew that the city they'd all agreed on wasn't the real one. Here is the part they didn't know. Long before Byron Kessler ever noticed Naomi across a fundraiser for the volunteer fire department, back when she was 24, and driving up from Waterloo with a mechanical engineering degree, and a head full of things she wanted to build, Naomi had loved airplanes. Not in the way people say they love the ocean or love the mountains, as a feeling, but the way a mechanic loves an engine. Specifically, obsessively, hands-on. She'd spent 2 summers at a bushplane outfit near Sioux Lookout, learning how a de Havilland Beaver held together and, more usefully, all the ways it could come apart. She understood wildfire from the ground up because she'd watched the smoke roll in over the Boreal and seen how slow and blind the whole response could be. She married Byron at 29. His family had timber money and lakefront money, the kind of Muskoka wealth that photographs well and doesn't need to explain itself. And for a while Naomi let herself be folded into it. The Kesslers had a way of making her feel that her interests were charming rather than serious. Her tinkering, Genevieve called it. Byron would introduce her at parties as his wife who does something with drones, and everyone would smile. And Naomi would smile back and change the subject. Because it was easier than watching their eyes drift. But she never stopped. In a rented unit in the industrial part of Bracebridge, 40 minutes from the lake house, Naomi and her closest friend from her Sioux Lookout summers. A soft-spoken, ferociously stubborn systems engineer named Priya Anand. Started building something in their evenings and weekends. It began as detection, cheap sensor arrays and a machine learning model that could spot the heat signature of an ignition in dense bush hours before a lookout tower or a satellite pass would catch it. Then it grew. Aircraft-mounted systems. Autonomous survey drones that could map a fire's edge in real time and hand the picture to the crews and the water bombers so nobody was flying blind into smoke. They called the company Northlines Aerial. For years it was small and it was quiet and it lost money, and then it stopped losing money, and then, very slowly, and then all at once, it became the thing that several provincial fire agencies and eventually a couple of national forestry services, could not imagine operating without. Naomi reinvested everything. She flew out to Kelowna and Fort McMurray and Timmins during fire seasons and slept in motels that smelled of smoke and came home with soot in the creases of her hands. Byron thought she was going to conferences. When the marriage started to crack, and it cracked the way most things do, slowly, along seams that had been there a long time. Naomi did one thing that she would later be grateful for beyond all measure. She sat down with a lawyer, a plain-spoken woman in Barrie who had no connection to the Kessler family's usual circle, and she quietly and completely protected her ownership of Northline. Not out of spite, out of a single clear thought that had come to her at 3 in the morning while Elodie slept down the hall. Whatever else happened, this was going to be Elodie's future, and no one was going to be able to take it in a settlement. She restructured. She moved the holding entity. She made sure that on paper, the company had nothing to do with the marriage. Byron never noticed, because Byron never asked. Why would he? The visible wealth was all his family's. The lake house, the boats, the timber shares, those were the things that looked like money to him. And next to those, his wife's little airplane company was a hobby that occasionally kept her out late. When the divorce came, his lawyers went after the marital assets with enthusiasm and found exactly what Naomi had left for them to find. Her share of a house that was mostly in the Kessler name to begin with, a car, half of a modest savings account. They took it all and declared victory. Naomi let them. She signed everything they put in front of her without a fight, and Byron mistook that for defeat. And Genevieve mistook it for stupidity. And the whole town mistook it for a sad story about a woman who'd married up and lost. Which brings us back to the snow. Naomi was maybe 30 feet from the Corolla, close enough to see the parking ticket someone had tucked under the wiper, when she first heard it. At the edge of hearing, low, a rhythmic beat under the hush of falling snow. She stopped, and Elodie stopped with her, looking up. The sound grew. Within a few seconds it wasn't at the edge of anything. It filled the whole gray afternoon. People coming down the courthouse steps slowed and turned. The reporter from the Weekly lifted his head. On the far side of the parking lot, past the cleared strip of municipal lawn, the frozen expanse of Cedar Lake stretched white and flat toward the trees. And it was over that white expanse that the helicopter came. Big and dark against the low sky, coming in fast and then bleeding off speed with the confidence of a pilot who'd set down in worse. It was not a sleek little billionaire's toy. That was the first thing several people would remember later. It was a working machine, matte and purposeful, with a stylized logo on the tailboom that a couple of the crews who'd fought fires up north actually recognized. Northline. It came down onto the plowed municipal lot in a storm of its own snow, rotors thundering, and the crowd on the courthouse steps put their hands over their faces and their coats snapping around them, and for a moment nobody said a word. Byron came a few steps down, frowning. Some corporate thing, he said, to no one. Search and rescue maybe. The rotors wound down. A side door opened and a man in a flight suit climbed out. Early 40s, calm, moving through the wind like it wasn't there. And he did not look confused about where he was going. He walked straight across the lot, past the courthouse steps, past Byron and Genevieve and Meredith, and stopped in front of Naomi and her daughter. Mrs. Fenwick. He nodded, and there was warmth in it, the warmth of someone who worked for a person he respected. We're ready whenever you are. Weather's supposed to close in out of the west by 5, so sooner's better if you want a smooth ride home. The whole parking lot had gone silent except for the ticking of the cooling engine. Naomi felt something loosen in her chest that had been clenched for 14 months. Thanks, Wesley, she said. Give us 5 minutes. Elodie's whole face had changed. The tears were gone, replaced by something enormous. She tugged on her mother's coat. Mommy, she whispered, so loud it wasn't a whisper at all. Is that ours? Naomi looked down at her, and for the first time all day she smiled the real smile. The one Byron used to say he'd married her for before he stopped noticing it. One of them, Bug. Somewhere behind her, someone inhaled sharply. Genevieve's mouth had come open. And Byron was staring at the pilot, then at his ex-wife, then at the logo on the tail. And you could see the arithmetic starting up behind his eyes and coming out wrong the way arithmetic always did lately. One of them, he repeated. Before he could get any further with it, a black SUV turned in off the county road and pulled up at the edge of the lot, and 2 people got out, both in winter parkas over business clothes, one of them already talking on a phone and the other making straight for Naomi. With a grin on his face that was almost boyish, Reuben Ostroff had flown in from the coast that morning and had been trying to reach her since dawn, and he could not have cared less about the divorce or the courthouse or the small-town crowd. He had one piece of news and it was burning a hole in him. Naomi. He caught her free hand in both of his and shook it. I'm sorry, I know the timing, I couldn't wait, I had to be here in person. He was almost laughing. It closed. This morning. The federal contract and the 2 provinces signed, and the Meridian acquisition went through at the same time. The board confirmed it an hour ago. He lowered his voice, though not nearly enough. Naomi, the valuation crossed $2.4 billion. You did it. There are moments in a small town that people talk about for 20 years, and this became one of them. $2.4 billion. The words moved through the crowd, on the courthouse steps like a current. The reporter from the Weekly was suddenly not bored at all. He had his phone out and was already texting his editor. And his editor was already forwarding it up the chain, because a homegrown Muskoka wildfire tech company, crossing $2 billion on the same afternoon its founder finalized a divorce in the local courthouse, was not a weekly newspaper story anymore. It was going to be a national one by supper. Byron's face had gone the color of the snow. For 14 months. For years, really. He had believed his wife's company was a way she kept herself busy. He'd signed off on the divorce papers with the smug certainty of a man who'd counted all the money in the room and found himself holding most of it. He had never once asked her a real question about the things she'd spent a decade of nights and weekends building. Because he'd already decided it wasn't worth asking about. And now he was watching a helicopter, one of them, sit in the courthouse parking lot while an executive who'd flown across the country told his ex-wife she was worth more than his entire family had accumulated in 3 generations of timber and lakefront. Genevieve had put a hand on her son's arm. Meredith had stopped smiling at the snow. Naomi listened to Reuben lay out the pieces. The crews they'd be able to hire. The northern communities that would get real coverage now. The second manufacturing site. And she nodded and asked 2 sharp questions about the northern rollout. Because even standing in a courthouse parking lot in the snow she was, above everything, a person who wanted to know that the work would get done right. Then she thanked him and told him she'd call from the air. It was Byron who broke the silence. He came down the last of the steps, and his voice, when it came, had lost all of its earlier weight. It was almost gentle now, almost pleading, though a man like Byron would never have admitted to pleading in his life. Naomi, wait, she turned. Maybe. He stopped, started again. Maybe we moved too fast. On all of it, maybe there's a conversation here we didn't have. You and me. He glanced involuntarily at the helicopter, and she saw him glance at it, and she saw that he saw her see. We were together a long time, that has to count for something. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. Snow was settling on his good wool coat, on his careful hair. She'd loved him once. Or loved the person she'd hoped he'd turn out to be. And standing there she felt the last of it go. Not with a slam, but with the quiet click of a door that's been ajar for years finally settling into its frame. You decided who I was a long time ago, Byron, she said. There was no cruelty in it. If anything, there was a kind of pity. You just never checked whether you were right. He didn't have an answer for that, there wasn't one. And what came to Naomi then, standing in the cold with her daughter's hand in hers, was not triumph. She'd expected, on some of those 3 a.m. nights, that if this day ever came it would taste like winning. It didn't. What she felt instead was a clear, almost sad understanding that Byron hadn't actually lost a fortune today. He'd lost the person who used to leave the porch light on for him. Who'd once driven 2 hours in a blizzard to bring him soup when he had the flu. Who had genuinely tried, for years, to make a marriage out of 2 people, who wanted increasingly different things. He'd traded that away a long time ago, one small dismissal at a time, and he'd been so busy counting the visible money that he never noticed the account he was actually draining. Elodie tugged her sleeve again, quieter this time. Mommy, are we going? Naomi's face softened the way it only did for her daughter. We sure are, Bug. She let Wesley take the duffel bag. She lifted Elodie over the strip of plowed slush and set her down by the open door of the helicopter, and helped her up into the cabin, and buckled the small body into a seat that swallowed her. And Elodie's eyes were the size of loonies. Cameras had come out on the courthouse steps. The reporter shouted a question. Another voice shouted a second one. Naomi didn't turn around. She had learned over 14 months exactly how much a person's opinion of you is worth. And she had priced most of these opinions correctly. The rotor spun up. The machine lifted. And the courthouse and the parking lot, and the small dark shape of Byron Kessler, standing in the snow, all tilted and dropped away beneath them. And Cedar Lake spread out white and enormous. And then the whole town of Hartley's Landing was just a scatter of rooftops and one church steeple in the gray, growing smaller. Elodie had her face pressed to the window. It's so small now, she said, wonderstruck. Then she turned to her mother and asked the question the way only a 6-year-old can ask a thing, straight through the middle of it. Mommy, are we rich now? Naomi thought about how to answer that. She thought about all the words she could use, and how most of them were the wrong ones. She reached over and undid her own belt enough to lean across and gather her daughter up against her side, tucking Elodie's cold little hand between both of her warm ones, the way she had 1,000 times. "You know what rich is?" she said, close to Elodie's ear under the noise of the rotors. "Rich is this. Rich is when the person you love most in the whole world falls asleep on your shoulder on the ride home, and you'd hand back every last engine in the sky just to keep her there another minute." Elodie considered this with great seriousness. "That's not really money though," she pointed out. Naomi laughed, the first full laugh she'd laughed in longer than she could remember, and it startled her with how good it felt. "No, baby. It's not. That's kind of the whole point." Elodie was asleep before they cleared the far shore of the lake. The story broke that night, and by the weekend it had a life of its own, the way these things do now. Northline Aerial's founder. 2.4 billion. The divorce and the helicopter, and the small courthouse in cottage country. Strangers online decided she was a hero. Other strangers decided the whole thing was too tidy to be true. A comment somewhere pointed out, not unreasonably, that a helicopter can't just land in a courthouse lot. And someone from the town replied that actually, the municipal lot backs onto the lake, and the fire department uses it for medevac all the time. And the argument went on the way arguments do. Naomi didn't read any of it. She was in Timmins by Monday, walking a crew through the northern coverage rollout, sleeves rolled up, soot already back in the creases of her hands. Here is the part that mattered more than the helicopter. Though it never trended anywhere, Naomi never got even. She had every means to, and she never once used them. There was a season, early on, when people expected it, expected her to buy up the Kessler Timber shares out from under them, expected some quiet, ruthless flourish. It never came. When Kessler Timber ran into trouble a few years later, the way old family firms sometimes do, when the person running them has always cared more about how the family looked than how the business ran. Naomi could have let it fold or bought it for parts. Instead she quietly kept 40 people in Hartley's Landing, employed by routing a parts and maintenance depot through the old mill site. And she made sure Byron never found out she was the reason his hometown didn't lose those 40 jobs, because she wasn't doing it for Byron. She was doing it for the pharmacist, and the hockey coach and the woman at Service Ontario, the whole cast of people who had once looked at her with pity, and who would never know that the person they'd written off had turned out to be the one keeping their lights on. She moved back to the region eventually, to a plain, warm, unremarkable house on a smaller lake, nothing like the Kessler place, with a kitchen that got the morning sun and a mudroom permanently full of Elodie's boots. She could have lived anywhere on earth. She chose a house with a good school 10 minutes away, because the thing she'd promised herself in the wreckage of the marriage was the thing she kept. She was going to be there. And she was. She was at the winter concerts where Elodie played third recorder from the left and hit maybe half the notes. She was at the rink at 6 in the morning with a Tim Hortons cup going cold in her hand, cheering for a Pee-wee team that lost more than it won. She coached the science fair, badly with too much enthusiasm. She was the mother who actually knew the names of her daughter's friends, all of them, and their allergies. Priya became Northline's chief engineer and Elodie's honorary aunt. And the two women who'd built a company out of evenings and stubbornness in a rented Bracebridge unit would sometimes stand at the back of a hangar, watching a new aircraft come together, and just look at each other and shake their heads, because neither of them had quite let themselves believe, back then, that any of it would work. The company kept growing. Northline's systems ended up over fires in 3 countries. There were seasons out west when whole towns didn't burn, because a Northline drone had caught an ignition at 2 in the morning and handed the crews 4 hours they wouldn't otherwise have had. And the people in those towns went to bed that night and got up the next day, and never knew how close it had come. And Naomi liked it that way. She thought that was the best kind of work there was. The kind nobody thanks you for, because they never find out they needed it. Byron, for his part, had a harder time of it, though not in any way Naomi engineered. The family fortune thinned the way visible fortunes tend to when there's no quiet builder underneath keeping them honest. He and Meredith didn't last. Genevieve got old and, people said, a little bitter. Byron would sometimes see the Northline name in the paper or on the side of a truck, and feel a thing he didn't have a good word for. Somewhere between regret and a kind of vertigo. The feeling of a man who realizes he was standing next to something remarkable for years, and spent the whole time looking the other way. He never really understood it, even at the end. He kept thinking of it as money he'd missed out on. He never once landed on the truth, which was that the thing he'd missed out on had a face. and a stubborn streak, and a way of leaving the porch light on. And it had been sitting across the breakfast table from him for the better part of a decade. As for the day at the courthouse, the helicopter, the 2.4 billion, the whole small town legend of it, Naomi almost never talked about it. When Elodie got older, a teenager and then a young woman with her mother's hands and her mother's stubborn streak, she'd sometimes ask about it. And Naomi would tell it plainly, without varnish, and always with the same ending. The helicopter wasn't the point, she'd say. The money wasn't the point. Neither was your father, God help him. The point was that the whole town had decided it knew exactly who I was, and it was wrong. And the only thing that let me walk out those doors, without needing to prove anything to any of them, was that I already knew who I was, and I'd known the whole time. You build the real thing quietly, she'd tell her daughter. And you build it, whether or not anyone's clapping. And you build it for the people who'll never know you built it. Everything else, the flashy part, the part people remember, that just falls out of the sky at the end and lands in the parking lot, and honestly, Bug, it's the least interesting thing that happened that day. And then she'd usually add, because it was true, and because it still made her laugh. The least interesting thing that happened that day, and it's the only part anyone ever wants to hear about. Elodie learned to fly when she was 17. Naomi taught her, in a battered old beaver on floats, out over the northern lakes, where her mother had first fallen in love with the whole business, half a lifetime before. And on the evening of Elodie's first solo, the two of them sat on a dock, with the engine ticking as it cooled behind them, and the loon starting up somewhere across the water, and neither of them said much, because there wasn't much that needed saying. The sky went from gold to gray to a deep and quiet blue, and the first stars came out over the trees, and Naomi Fenwick, who had once walked out of a courthouse with a duffel bag and a used car and a town's worth of pity, and who had turned out to be, all along, the richest person in it, sat on a dock with her daughter, and understood that she had gotten the only thing she'd ever actually been building toward. The rest of it, all of it, had only ever been the sound of the rotors, coming in low over the lake, arriving right on time,